Hi children, good morning. Welcome back to our session. What is our topic? Reproduction in plants. So yesterday's class we have seen about the spore formation in the fungi, is it? So these are the asexual reproduction. Now today let me start about the sexual reproduction in the plants. So sexual reproduction means by sowing of the seeds we are going to get the plants. This process only we call it as the sexual reproduction. So in this we are having the stamen or the male reproductive part. Pistil is the female reproductive part. I can show you the picture of the female and as well as the male. So in a flower we are having the two types. One is the male and one is the female. The male reproductive part we call it as the stamen and the female one we call it as the pistil. What we call? The female one we call it as the pistil and the male one we call it as the stamen. Next, flowers which contain either only pistil or only stamens are called unisexual flowers. What are unisexual flowers, children? In a flower, what we told? Male and female. But here, either the male or the female, only one will be present. Like those flowers, we call it as the uni. Uni means only the single. Unisexual flowers. Flowers which contain either only pistil or only the stamens are called as the unisexual flowers. For this the examples are corn, papaya, cucumber. So in this we can see either the male or the female one, pistil or the stamen. If it is having both, what we will say? Flowers which contain both stamen and also the pistil are called as the bisexual flowers. What do you mean by bi? Means two, which the flowers will be having the both male and the female one. We call it as bisexual flowers. For this, the example are rose, mustard, etc. So these are the examples for bisexual flowers. So in a flower, only the single one or either the male or the female will be having, means we call it as the unisexual flowers. If it is having the both, we call it as the bisexual flowers. Here is the diagram of stamen and pistil. Stamen is the male reproductive system. Pistil is the female reproductive system. So let me see the parts. So this pipe-like structure we call it as the filament. The up one we call it as the anther. What is that? Anther. What do you mean by the anther? This anther contains pollen grains which produce the male gametes. What does the work done by the anther? The anther contains pollen grains which produce the male gametes. Then let me come to the pistil. These two are the same only, children. So to show for you the ovary and the ovule, we have taken like this. So the up one we call it as the stigma. It will be like a sticky one. This is called stigma. The down, like this, the pipe structure we call it as the still, and here we will be having the ovary. So if you open it and see here the like a small eggs, we call it as the ovule. And so this is the structure of this pistil. Okay. So stigma, still, ovary. If you open it, we can see the eggs. That is nothing but the ovule. So what does this ovary contains? Ovary contains one or more ovals. One or more ovals. Then the female gamete or the egg is formed in the oval. So here the eggs will be formed for us. In sexual reproduction, the male and the female gamete fuse to form as the zygote. So it's very important. What do you mean by the zygote? in this sexual reproduction. One is the male one and one is the female one. This male and female gamete fuse to form. That means if it is going to fuse it, it is going to form it as the zygote. Okay. Now let me see the parts of a pollen in a flower. Okay, children. Next, let me go for the pollination. What is meant by pollination? So here are two types of the pollination. So this figure, it shows the self-pollination and this one it shows the cross-pollination. First of all, what do you mean by pollination? Let me see. The transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma of a flower is called pollination. What do you mean by pollination? The transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma is called as pollination. So in this we are having the two types, that is the self-pollination and the cross-pollination. So in this figure you can see, children, the middle part we call it as the stigma and the sides which we are having, this one we call it as the anther. So the transfer of pollen from the anther to the stigma. So here it will be having some yellow color one. So I can show you in the picture there. So that yellow color one will be pollen to this. So this anther will be in the yellow in color, that it will be pollen on this stigma. This formation only we call it as the pollination. So now let me see what do you mean by the self-pollination and what do you mean by the cross-pollination. What is self-pollination? If the pollen lands on the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant. So here it should be the same plant, but the pollen lands on the stigma of the same flower or the another flower. So if you take one plant, maybe there will be more flowers, is it? So same plant should be different flowers also maybe. So this process only we call it as the self-pollination. That means in one tree many flowers will be, in that flowers they can combine. That is the anther and the stigma. So self-pollination, if the pollen lands on the stigma in the same flower or another flower in the same plant, we call it as the self-pollination. Then what do you mean by the cross-pollination? When the pollen of flower lands on the stigma of a flower of a different part of the same kind. Here of the different part of the same kind. So we call it as the cross-pollination. So this is about the pollination. So we have learned what do you mean by pollination, its types, that is the self-pollination and the cross-pollination. So I have shown the picture of the pollination also. So today let me end up this session and tomorrow with a new topic we can come. Okay, thank you children.
Sexual reproduction in plants. In this module, you will learn how sexual reproduction takes place in flowering plants. It is spring season. Flowers are blooming on the trees. It is indeed a beautiful sight. Flowers attract all of us. They are the most beautiful part of the plant, isn't it? You already know that flowers are not present only to add beauty to the plant. They are in fact the reproductive part of the plant. In the flower, stamen is the male reproductive part, while carpel is the female reproductive part. Some flowers contain both male and female reproductive parts. Such flowers are called bisexual flowers. For example, pea, China rose, etc. On the other hand, some flowers possess either the male or the female reproductive parts. Such flowers are called unisexual flowers. For example, corn, cucumber, etc. Now let us know about the different parts that make up a stamen and a carpel. A stamen is made of two main parts, anther and filament. The anther produces pollen grains. It is the pollen grain that contains the male gametes. A carpel, on the other hand, is made up of three parts. The terminal part is called the stigma. The middle elongated part is the style, and the swollen bottom part is the ovary. Inside the ovary, ovules are present. It is the ovule that has the female gamete called the egg cell. For sexual reproduction to take place, a male gamete is to be fused with the female gamete, thereby forming a zygote. Now for that, the male gametes have to reach the female gametes. For this, first a pollen grain carrying the male gametes is transferred from the stamen of a flower to the stigma of the same or the other flower. Such transfer of pollen grains is known as pollination. If the pollen grain of a flower lands on the stigma of the same flower, it is called self-pollination. But if the pollen grain of a flower lands on the stigma of another flower of the same or another plant of the same type, it is called cross-pollination. Pollination occurs with the help of different agents like wind, water, or animals. Once a pollen grain reaches the stigma of a suitable flower, a tube grows from the pollen grain. This tube travels through the style and reaches the ovary. The male gamete from the pollen travels in this tube and reaches to the female gamete present in the ovule of the ovary. After that, the male and the female gamete fuse together to form the zygote. This process of fusion of male and female gametes is called fertilization. The zygote formed after the fertilization then divides several times to form an embryo inside the ovule. The ovule develops a tough coat and changes to a seed. The ovary, on the other hand, ripens and forms a fruit around the seed.